I know you've done this a million times, but if you could just explain what is meant by intuitive eating, okay, for someone who's never heard of it before.
I'll start really broad, and then I'll get a little more specific. So we can, there's many ways to define intuitive eating, but it's a self-care eating framework that's rooted in the compassion for all bodies. And what that really means is that you're the expert of your experiences. There are 10 principles, not rules, 10 principles or guideposts. There is also an intuitive eating assessment scale. In fact, a brand new one just got published. And there's almost 300 studies to date on intuitive eating, really showing a lot of benefits. So it's actually really, really exciting. And if we start getting into this, there's a lot of myths around intuitive eating. Some people, have the mistaken belief that it's just about eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. And it's like, okay, there's 2 principles that have to do around hunger and fullness, but it's not this precise pass or go. If you end up getting too hungry, in other words, you don't honor your hunger when you first experience it, not a problem. It's just that your hunger is going to be more intense and more urgent. And if you eat past comfortable fullness, again, not a problem. It might just mean that you're not going to be very hungry at your next meal or at the time that when you ordinarily ate. Exactly. And I think one of the most actually, let me restate this. So the one of the unifying principles of intuitive eating, or the hub of intuitive eating, is aiming for satisfaction when you eat. And I often like to start there because it's such a personal experience, and it's really pleasure-based if you think about it. Ultimately, it's not pleasurable to, undereat. It's not pleasant to eat past comfortable fullness. And so the question becomes, what is satisfaction for you? What kind of foods, what kind of conditions, how do you want to feel when you finish eating? There's all kinds of stuff. And it's been amazing to me over all these years, the amount of people I've worked with that really have no idea. And it makes sense. I'll say, it makes a lot of sense, because if you've been dieting all your life, by whatever name you call it, lifestyle change, keto lifestyle, there's so many names now, but following some kind of food plan, it's outsourcing your eating experiences to somebody else, and it's outside, it's external. So you don't get to know your preferences or what truly satisfies. It's all about the rules, and that's how trust starts to get disrupted. And it's one of the biggest feedbacks I get from readers, that they think, intuitive eating is a beautiful model. It's great for other people, but they don't trust that it works for their body. And so one of the things I like to look at, let's look at how trust got undermined in your life. Every time you go on some kind of restricted food plan for the purpose of trying to change your body weight, every time you try and trick out hunger, every time you try and trick out fullness, that contributes to disruption of this trust. But the good news is trust can be rebuilt. It can be repaired, every time you honor hunger. So there's many ways to get down this path. And one of the things I like to say about intuitive eating is a pathway out of suffering. Diet culture is a root of suffering for a lot of people. And so there's a way out of it. You don't have to live in this way.
But the hard thing is that before they build that trust, they need to trust the process, or trust that they'll get there. Right? And that's where I come in.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. That's where you come in. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, I was going to say that, I would also say the more complex someone's history,
that's true.
If you have trauma in your history, or you have an eating disorder in your history, you've got an anxiety disorder, other kinds of things, it's still workable, but what it might mean is you would benefit from working with somebody who's been trained in intuitive eating, such as yourself, in terms of helping and support you in the process.
And also, the more you are closer to a straight-sized body, the easier it is because the pressure is more internal than external.
That is so true. The research also bears that out as well on many levels. When you have a body that conforms to the social norm, you're not questioning as much your eating choices or your fullness and hungers and those kinds of things. But when you've been in a body that's deemed too big, and especially if it's been happening since you were a little child, then you've been sold the message that you can't be trusted with your appetite, you can't be trusted with your body. And so there's a lot of healing and a lot of repair that needs to be done. And this is where I like to say this is a great message for parents. You know, parents are doing the best they can, but sometimes well-meaning parents end up putting so much focus on their kids eating and on their body that it ends up disrupting this trust and creating more problems. On the other hand, if parents trust their own bodies, trust their appetites, that can also get fostered down to their kids as well. So one of the things I love to say is, wouldn't it be wonderful to end the legacy of diet culture at your own kitchen table? You know, to try and end the whole legacy of culture globally is so daunting. But the idea that, well, in my home, you know, we're not going to disparage bodies. We're not going to disparage food. That can be a wonderful, wonderful beginning. Definitely.
And gives us the hope we need. Who would benefit the most, or who is intuitive eating for?
What a great question. You know, when we originally wrote Intuitive Eating, you know, we can say it was really research inspired. It was based on our experiences working with a lot of people, mainly women, who were suffering at the hands of dieting and feeling like they were utter failures. And what we like to say is, what has failed you is not you. It is the whole system of dieting. That's the real problem. And so we reviewed and did a big analysis of the research, factored in our clinical experience, also what was going on in just mainstream books. And one of the researchers that really influenced our work, and I am going to answer your question, was L.L. Birch. And she was somebody who was an expert in the parent-child feeding relationship. And she's the one that has shown that, you know, when a well-meaning parent restricts their kids' eating, they create the opposite effect. They end up developing an obsession for the foods that they can't have. They'll go out and sneak the foods, and they end up being more dysregulated and disconnected to their bodies. And so while we aimed the intuitive eater at the general kind of chronic dieter, a lot of the research is really based on kids. And what's happening now in the research world, which is so exciting, it's really being viewed as, quote, an adaptive model of eating. In other words, it's a psychologically healthy way to go for your physical and mental well-being. So it really can be for anybody. And then where it gets complex, you know, if somebody has conditions, it might just mean you need some more support or scaffolding to integrate intuitive eating in your particular situation.
Okay.
Like if you have an eating disorder, for example.
All right. And when you were working on it, or all those years as you adapted it and had different editions of the book, was there anything that changed about your eating?
Oh, what a great question. Yes and no. I've never talked about this, and it's something at some point I will talk more in detail about. But, you know, as a dietitian, you know, with a master's degree in nutrition science, or sometimes I call it a master's degree in diet culture. I did get some really good training, though. You know, in the beginning, I was part of diet culture. I used to write a column for Shape magazine. It's a national women's magazine in the United States. That was about how to make your recipes healthier. And so readers would send in their favorite recipes, and I would tinker around with them and either made them lower in calories or something. I was always trying to improve upon that. And it was something I was doing in my everyday life. I no longer do that anymore. My first question is, how's it going to be the most tasty and the most satisfying? And I go with that. So that's how I have changed. I had to unlearn some of the diet culture that I was taught with. And at the same time, no shame to anyone who does modify some of the recipes, you know. I think there's that fine balance, you know, where, maybe we can make something incredibly tasty, just as good. But how often is that really the case where it's just as good, you know? So that's something that has changed for me. And who had a big influence on my career was Julia Child, a very famous chef in the United States. Although I think she was known globally, you know, and I was on one of her task force, a bunch of nutritionists and dietitians and a bunch of chefs, you know, like, can we all get along? Let's find a common message. And we would meet monthly. we'd also go out, and I loved eating with chefs, because what chefs do when they eat out as a group, they all order a different entree, and when it comes, you take a couple of bites and you pass the plate down, and so you get exposed to so many different kinds of foods, and even things that I wouldn't have again. Like, I remember eating cilantro ice cream.
Oh, wow.
And I love cilantro, but with ice cream, I don't think those two go together. But so anyways, what it did, it really exposed my palate to the food world. And what the message ended up being as a result of our meetings and so on is to, the nutritionists of the world, please consider taste when you're factoring in any kind of, nutrition guidelines. And to the chefs of the world, can you factor in a little bit of nutrition? So in other words, it's kind of finding the middle way.
Yeah.
That's what we were actually looking at. So with those experiences, that's how I have changed. No one's ever asked me that question. Excellent question.
Okay, thank you. I came across this quote or this saying, and it really made me realize how much it applies to what we do, or our work, or your work, or diet culture in general, which is, it's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled.
Oh my gosh. I love that quote.
I know, isn't it amazing? Even though it came up because it was something about the moon landing is fake. But what statistics do you use? And I know you like your numbers. What statistics would you use for skeptics?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways that I like to go. So if we get really into the juicy details, I like to get into the weight science research. And that is when you start looking at all these weight loss studies, if you start looking at the longer term effects, which is seldomly done. Usually the studies are too short to capture the long-term effects or the unintended consequences. And one of the biggest ones we see is that by year 5, up to 2/3 of people have gained back not just all the weight that they lost, but they gained back more.
Yeah.
And now there's even a term for it called weight cycling, when you keep gaining and losing the same weight and it escalates upward. And what we're seeing now with weight cycling research, there really is a very strong link with illness and death, morbidity, mortality. It's linked with, blood sugar dysregulation. So in other words, going on a diet for the sake of losing weight is not without its harm. It increases the risk for eating disorders. It's just really profound when we look at the body of research. And it kind of goes back to that quote that a lot of people are in disbelief about that.